Hi there, this is Scott Silverman on behalf of the NCGR Florida Atlantic chapter, and we're here to speak briefly with Maurice Fernandez about an upcoming workshop he'll be doing the 19th of November. Yes, okay. And the topic of this workshop.
It's the 12th house where the sun rises every morning.
Excellent. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to converse with us. And my first question is, where do you currently reside?
I'm in Sedona, Arizona.
Oh, excellent. I did not know that. And that is one of my favorite places.
It's
Okay.
beautiful.
Will you please go to the Chapel of the Holy Cross for me? That's one of my favorite places to sit and meditate. So, not because
Sure.
of any religious thing. I just love the energy and the vibe there. Um, you were born, I believe, in Bujumbura, Burundi. Did I say
Mm-hmm.
that right?
Yep.
And you came of age in Israel. And how
Mhm.
did this geographical trajectory come about? And before I go any further, on behalf of the NCGR, we'd like to wish you a happy birthday because I
Thank you.
believe you just had your solar return on the 5th of November.
I did. Thank you. Thank you. One more round. um, yeah, growing up in Africa was in a way wonderful, very sheltered, and living in nature was really a blessing. And then we moved to Israel when I was a teenager. Sorry, and it was, looking back, it was definitely a difficult transition to learn a new language and new alphabet, kind of reset everything. But at the time, I was just in it, so I didn't feel that it was any, I didn't realize how hard it was.
Why was your family in Africa? Farming, CIA? I mean,
No,
Israeli CIA?
no. Not that I know. My father was born in Africa.
Okay.
There were many people living in Africa. It's just, yeah. I believe his parents basically ran away from Europe during the war. And they, his father went in many different places. He actually tried to get into the US and wasn't allowed in, and then took his chance and went to Africa, and that's where he grew up. And then he married my mom and schlepped her to the jungles.
And so you grew up in the jungle with a lot of what we would call wildlife.
Well, it's the capital city of the
Okay, I'm totally
country.
embroidering. All right.
But yeah, there was a lot of wildlife, national parks, and but we use the capital city was by a lake, and just like in Florida, you have to watch the alligators. There in Bujumbura, we had to be careful of crocodiles and hippos, but otherwise, was yeah, nice and beautiful.
So tell me, do you still subscribe to earlier models of the 12th house in terms of when it would be called the house of self-undoing, or Lily would say it might have to do with witchcraft or the occult? Although I was also always taught that the 12th house was the house of spiritual liberation, and especially the type of liberation found in seclusion of the 40 days in the wilderness variety.
I do, but I'm not limiting myself to that. My whole approach to the 12th house, which, I wrote a 500-page book on.
Yes, I have the first
Uh,
edition. I need to get the
so
second.
the second is really worth it. There's a lot of changes and it's really improved. But just to answer your question, what I feel is that some of these difficult definitions are quite fragmented, and people who study astrology are presented with these definitions without understanding why, what's behind it. So my attempt in this study and in the coming presentation is to understand that there's a thread. There is some kind of evolutionary development that happens through the 12th house. And part of it, and I will say like 5 to 10%, and I would even go more towards the 5, is that self-undoing and, addiction issues or things like that. But the deeper meaning of the 12th house is that in many ways it's a gateway to living beyond time and space and living beyond the material dimension. So it's basically our access to spiritual development, but it's also our access to what unifies everything, everyone. So the reason there's self-undoing in the 12th house is because people who have a concentration of energies there, or even, enough having one planet, if it's strategically influential, is that there's difficulty integrating into time and space. So in some ways, 12th house people feel like they don't really want to be here. They don't understand, and I'm generalizing, of course, there are many variables and layers, but as a whole archetype, there's a feeling that life on a day-to-day basis, which is, paying your bills and surviving and facing the daily struggles, is so limiting. It's so confining when there is such a higher and purer reality. Think about the 12th house opposing the 6th house, which has to do with routine. So the routine, doesn't appeal to 12th house people, and scheduling your day is not interesting. There's a feeling that there's much more to life than this. So in some ways, people with 12th house can feel we tend to think that the 12th house is behind the scenes and hidden, but in reality, people with strong 12th house are actually the most exposed because they don't have protection. They don't totally understand danger. And as a result, they can feel overwhelmed because they are so exposed, because they're such a thin skin. And so there can be adaptation issues. There can be a feeling that they don't want to do this thing called, having a job and paying your bills. And that can lead to escapism, and in whatever way, whether it's sugarcoating things or trying to run away from those responsibilities. But again, that's a small portion of these experiences. I believe, and that's what I want to really dive into as we will explore this workshop is to understand the sequence. There's some kind of thread and different outcomes. Like if you understand the main motivation, then you can understand what are the possible outcomes. So one of the outcomes is the self-undoing. So I would agree with the traditional definition. My point is that it's just a tiny part of it. There's much more to the 12th house.
That's such a great explanation. Thank you. Now, I'm really looking forward to the workshop. Speaking of escapism, do you think isolation or flotation tanks are a 12th house therapeutic? Water house, after all.
Because the experience of isolation is complex, because the 12th house, as I say, is also a house where you're the most exposed. Think about many public figures who have packed 12th house, such as Biden. You know, he's born with a stellium in the 12th, and people like Madonna, you know.
Did Obama have a 12th house sun? Remember.
No, he has a 6th house sun, but
All
he
right.
had Saturn, Jupiter in the 12th, which relate to obviously his career in law and his career in politics. You know, Saturn, Jupiter have to do with leadership, with legislation and law. So the 12th house is a house of service. And whatever planet or sign is there can definitely be an avenue of public service. And that again complements the 6th house of work.
You mean public service without scandal or self-undoing necessarily?
I mean, people who have a packed 12th house are people who quite often have to sacrifice their personal need for the greater whole. So that doesn't mean necessarily that they're not getting paid for what they're doing. It's definitely can be a job, but I see the 12th house as a career house, which is a big like, whoa, what? You know, you're supposed to be hiding in the mountains when you have a 12th house. But because you're so exposed and because you touch the public, and like I mentioned, you know, you have several public figures with strong 12th house who are constantly in the public eye, but they have to overcome, sacrifice their personal wants. And so you get to a point with the 12th house where you feel like you're overwhelmed. It's too much. You know, people are constantly around you and you have that thin skin. So then the reaction is shutting down, hiding, because the defense, when people need to defend themselves, 12th house people need to defend themselves. They're not going to charge. They're not going to confront. They're going to disappear.
Retreat, put the drawbridge up of the castle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's the weapon of invisibility, hiding, and all of that. But to me, that's not the starting point. The starting point is not hiding. The starting point is actually being out there, but because it gets to be too much, because you feel like you're constantly exposed to everyone's energy and everyone's thought, and you become the object of projection, then you need to retreat, to just regroup and reconnect with yourself. So I would say, yes, you know, you do need to, you know, cyclically, periodically take time out. And remember what I said earlier, the 12th house is a place where you step out of time. And that's exactly what I'm saying. It's time out. I need time out of my life. So I need to, you know, get out of the rat race or whatever it is. But you will also see that the 12th house is the house of vacation. because it's the house where you get out of time, where you suddenly, escape to paradise, on your little island, and you forget about time and your duties. So again, some kind of parallel with the sixth house, where the sixth house has to do with work and showing up and being on point. The 12th house is, I'm not here, I'm not available, leave a message.
Right. Wow. Do you associate the 12th house in any way with renewal, resurrection, or ascension?
Good question. Ascension for sure, because from a 12th house point of view, there is almost a fear, a resistance to descend. As I said, I don't want to be here. As 12 housers, there's a feeling like I don't want to incarnate. I'd rather stay in spirit. So the quicker I can ascend, the better, at least from that point of view. I'm not saying that's healthy, but I'm saying it's often the reaction. So renewal, I will say renewal comes through the first house, where the 12th house is more of a end of cycle. That's where you complete and you're done and you feel like you're gifting. That's why it's a house of service, because it's the house where you actually can be very ripe and you've done your whole 12th house up to that point, and you're ready to just give it back to people, give it back to the nation, giving back to the earth. And so there is a lot of letting go. And in that sense, it prepares you for the renewal of the first house, which the first house I would see as a new cycle, as that new birth.
Okay. I always think I studied Hellenistic astrology in the early days of Kepler College, and Demetra George was sort of relaying the work of Robert Schmidt to the Kepler students. And she was surprised to find out she always thought of herself as a 12th house sun. But when you use whole sign houses, she was suddenly a first house sun. So, do you have any thoughts of the people that actually transform when you switch your house system? And I don't know what house system you use. I always like to look at whole sign houses, but I'm afraid I have to confess I use Placidus or Porphyry, what I started with. But do you
Yeah,
make
I
it?
mean, I think both systems offer a perspective. The way I like to look at house system is that they're all windows to the same central court. So none of the house system gives you a complete picture. They just give you an angle to whatever is happening. And so it's healthy actually to change house system and see if there are changes.
What are your top three, Maurice?
I use quadrant house system. I
Okay.
do, to me, the ascendant divides, the upper sky and the lower sky. It makes sense to me. And so if the sun, didn't rise yet, I don't know why it would be in the 12th house. In the 12th house, we have things that are above the horizon
Right. And that would
or
even
below.
be it actually the 12th house demarks diurnal charts from nocturnal charts. So it's
Yeah.
actually very important in that sense.
And that's, to me, that's a little confusing with the Hellenistic tradition that takes sect into consideration and yet uses whole sign. But, my point of view is that there is a rationale for conflating sign and houses. That kind of, connection between having a full sign in a house, I think keeps a symmetry between the signs more intact. And there's a reasoning to that. Astrology has a lot of geometry to it and a lot of symmetry. So I think it's worth looking at it. But if I look at evolution, which is my choice of practice, evolutionary astrology, looking at the quadrant house system seems to be more revealing. It seems to work better for my approach.
Okay, sticking with the Hellenistic theme for a moment, Saturn is said to be in its joy in the 12th house, according to Hellenistic astrology. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not a Hellenistic astrologer. I have my ideas about that, but to me, one of the things that I apply when working with evolutionary astrology is that there is a process. Nothing is inherently joyful or sad, if you know what I mean, in the sense that Saturn in the 12th can get you to prison, but it can also connect you to spiritual leaders. So, and make you a spiritual leader. So it has the highest virtues, but it can also confine you to a miserable life. Now, as an evolutionary astrologer, I'm not just going to tell my client, well, you have two choices, be enlightened or rot in jail. But I'm going to explain why these could be outcomes. Because Saturn in the 12th house has to do with the need to understand that we don't only live by man-made laws, we also live by spiritual laws. So in some ways, people with Saturn in the 12th house can have the highest integrity, the highest ethical guidance, because they refer to a spiritual sense of integrity. But you will see some people with Saturn in the 12th house who disregard any kind of authority and guidance. And they can be people who get lost in life because there was no authority figure in their lives and they felt like driftwood, not having solid grounds. So I wouldn't just narrow it to good or bad. I think it's a process, and people will experience some of the good and some of the crisis points. But I can see why there's joy in it, in that kind of reference.
Well, it means that Saturn is happy to be in the 12th house. It does really well. Yeah.
But I'm saying there's no such guarantee that you're going to have only the virtues,
right?
Just by virtue of having a placement like that. But if you do predictive work or if you do horary work, it can work in such a way using Hellenistic references. So for me, who's doing more process-oriented work, psychological and spiritual, we don't use these categories.
Okay. I love your work on the lunar nodes. And I like how you're not just in one place about North Node, South Node. You really believe in finding the balance point between them and where they meet halfway. What would you tell someone that has the North Node in the 12th or the South Node in the 12th? Would you necessarily tell them very different things? Of course, the rest of the chart is involved, but
sure. Well, there's a whole chapter on the book just on the nodes in those houses.
In the book on Neptune.
Yeah.
In the 12th house, okay.
In the new edition, at least. But one thing I will say, I do, from my experience at least, I do see that the South Node is what you bring into this life.
Okay.
And so the North Node is a point of development. It is a gravitational pull. But what I would differ from other definition perhaps is that my point of view is that you bring the South Node with you, like it's a good asset. It's not something you get rid of. So even though you're coming with it, it doesn't represent weaknesses. It represents assets, things that you've developed. It's actually a point of strength. But then you can't just stay there. You need to embrace that balancing polarity of the North Node. And so life will constantly challenge you to learn about the North Node. So if you're coming from a 12th house South Node, you may be someone who, had spiritual consciousness, who was connected to higher truths, but you had difficulty, or the challenge now would be to bring it down to earth, how to bring spirit into matter. So many people with 12th house South Node can be very gifted, but they may be a bit awkward about what to do with themselves. It's like, I have so much potential, but I don't have strategy. So that's the North Node in the 6th house, is ground it, make something useful out of it. Sit down and write your book, don't just have it in your head. And the other way around is when you have a South Node in the 6th, you may be very strategic and very grounded, and you need a lot of control because you're someone who has, can fix things. But you can end up anxious. The South Node in the 6th can end up, in a way, not trusting, wanting to be everywhere, to pay attention to everything. And it can lead to anxiety. And so the 12th house North Node is about understanding what's not up to you, realizing there's a greater reality out there and you can't control it all. So that North Node in the 12th house means let it go, embrace, trust. I would say the word trust would be
surrender
relevant.
is an old word for the 12th house too. Yeah,
well,
trust and surrender are linked in a way.
Yeah. I mean, you cannot surrender without trusting.
Exactly. I'm gonna change gears here, and you've written so much on Neptune, and I couldn't help but notice that in about 2 months you're going to have Neptune squaring your moon. Do you have any expectations for the transit? Or are you just going to let it happen? Are you going to try to forget what you know about Neptune square the moon?
Well, I think it's not the first pass. So
okay,
I had a taste of it. And my moon is 23 Gemini. So Mars retrograde is having a run. Knock on wood, so far so good. Definitely a lot of need to improvise, kind of go day by day rather than make long-term plans. So what am I expecting? I hope I'm going to have time and carve the time to write more with the Gemini moon, because it's one of the reasons why I stepped down from OPA is to make more time for writing.
Okay,
so
great.
That's
your answer. You were once planning to study sound engineering, but astrology seems to have won out. Have you investigated any of the research done on the music of the spheres, or even things like acutonics, which tries to merge sound healing with astrology, or does merge? And it doesn't try to merge, does actually merge.
Yes, I have. Not enough that I can be an authority on it, but it's definitely, its frequency, it's and there's no doubt that all these different mediums mirror each other. And I can, I can definitely I know I have explored that, experimented with that, but there's nothing I can really say that I have concretely worked with. Now, I would recommend some of the work that Gemini Brett did with that, because
Okay.
he explored some of these references with musical notes and planets, and it's a lot of fun.
It is fascinating. And I'm pretty sure Gemini Brett is doing a workshop for this group later in the year. So this is good to know. You have a very psychic chart. How much of a role does intuition play in your astrological readings?
Everything I say, I can find it in the chart. So there's nothing in that sense that is just psychic and I'm not referring it. However, at the same time, the whole book about Neptune was a download.
It was almost channeled.
I would say so, because the way it started is that why write about Neptune in the first place? Certainly not a plan that I made. So it happened very spontaneously, and the way it happened is that I usually don't take notes when I teach, and for some reason I sat down and started to take notes, and in a very surprising way, a lot of material came through, and I kept writing and writing and writing, and
You mean you
a
wouldn't
lot
stop?
a lot of
You
a
just
lot
would
of
keep
things.
on. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, one thought would lead to another and
Yeah.
another, and then I did not know initially what I was writing. Like, this was new to me. This was new insights. These were not things I learned somewhere else. And I had to test it, because I was writing it down, but I needed to validate what I was writing. And I did a lot of research, working with charts and trying to apply this knowledge. And so that's why, it took a while to write the book and then to write the second edition, which kind of built on that ability to refine that bulk that was downloaded. So there was definitely, some kind of channeling happening. Um, but again, whatever I do refer it to the chart ultimately.
Okay. Excellent. Um, I couldn't help but notice you have an out of bounds moon in your chart, and I'm wondering if you work with declination at all.
I do. And at the same time, I'm not dramatizing the out of bound as something that's really crazy, as it often is, because every planet that's going to be on the solstice point has higher chances of being out of bound, whether it's end of Gemini, early Cancer, end of Sag, and early Capricorn. So these are the regions where the planets will be out of bound, because they're further away from the the planes of the between the ecliptic and the celestial equator. So I don't know what to, my moon, we can say I'm an astrologer, which is crazy. There's eccentricity in that, but if you ask me, my life's pretty normal from my subjective point of view. What would you expect as an out of bound moon? Like, what would you attribute to it?
I'm still researching it, and when I have advanced some of the theory to people with out of bounds moons, it can it can make them disagree vociferously. But I think I have an out of bounds Venus. I have an out of bounds Mars. So I like out of bounds planets myself, right? And I think I do a lot of work with declination. So I just find the whole declination portion of astrology very fascinating. I always like to look at the different coordinate systems and see where they're telling you the same thing and where they're telling you very different things, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit. We're going to have to wrap up. Let's talk a little bit about your work with the white lines. And I think interspecies communication is kind of an interest of yours or a reality of yours. And again, I would think that could be a very 12th house thing.
Mhm.
Have you been around, have you had the opportunity where you are around animal companions and you have their time charts and you've been able to work making connections between how they are and their birth charts? And I will say, I did have friends that had a Great Dane, and the breeder would write down to the second when the different pups were born. This dog lived out its chart, let me tell you. And it had a grand trine, and it was in air. I think it was a little high strung. So
Absolutely. I mean, like you say, my part of my, I have Gemini in the 12th house. So that communication that can be, beyond verbal and linear. Also, Mercury Neptune conjunct, I think, adds to that. And I've always felt very close to animals, sometimes because I can remember as a kid that people were scaring me, and I found animals to be safe. So there was something about my connection that started, very early on. And I will definitely see now as an astrologer, I had the privilege of having my mama cat give birth right on my bed as I was nursing her and being the doula.
oh, excellent.
So I had, three kitten born in the space of half an hour. And that day, the day it happened, the moon was to the minute on my son. And there, she was giving birth on my bed and I was there. So, there's obviously a connection. And what happened is that as you usually do when you have kittens, you find them homes and you hope for the best. But every time I try to find them homes, something would happen. And then someone actually came and wanted to get one of them. And I said, no, I'm not giving him to you. And so I ended up basically that moon sun connection meant that they were not going anywhere. I was going to be their dad and
Their mother and father with that moon
mother
sun.
and father,
Yeah.
and very deeply connected, psychically and emotionally. But as you mentioned, the white lions specifically,
Would
I've
you
done
would you
some.
just tell us a little bit, tell our viewers a little bit about the work you've been doing with the White Lines? I believe you have a nonprofit organization, if I'm not mistaken.
It's not mine, but I have
You
been
work with them,
involved.
yes.
It's called White Lions .org.
Our mutual friend Lynn Hyde went on one of your trips. Yes.
Absolutely.
So that's
Yes.
how I know about it.
So it's a very rare type of lion that only occurs naturally in South Africa, particularly on the east side of South Africa. There's a place called Timbavati. And Timbavati means Timba is lion and Vati is sky. So it's the place where the lions came from the sky and happens to be, aligned with the pyramids of Egypt, and we know that the Egyptian had a very strong connection with cats and lions. So these white lions are very, very rare, and I would suggest to read about lion shamanism by the book by Linda Tucker, Mystery of the White Lions, if you want to find out more. But just to touch on that, my work with the conservation is not only an ecological effort to preserve the species, because in South Africa, there's a whole trophy hunting lobby, and people like to hunt lions and put them on their walls. So there's that aspect of just conservation, why not protect endangered species? But there's also a spiritual dimension that really caught me. And what was really fascinating is that when I first encountered them, I wrote about the charts and the astrology to the head of that nonprofit, her name Linda Tucker. And lo and behold, she was so fascinated by astrology. She had studied astrology, and we started to make connections between all the events and the births of the lions and the timing of their birth with certain fixed stars,
Wow.
Regulus and Sirius, and so the amazing synchronicity, because we had that privilege to have birth dates, because as a nonprofit, she was monitoring them. They had collars and satellite tracking, and so she could know when they gave birth. So that kind of brought astrology into understanding the patterns that these lions respond to. And, one day there's going to be a book about that.
Oh, good. I was hoping you had written it up, or we're planning to. Wonderful. All right. Well, that's something to look forward to. I have a million other questions to ask you, but I'm going to wrap this up. But I have to ask if you believe in love at first sight and animal companions count.
Are these two questions or one question?
It's one question, because do you believe in love at first sight? But this could also be interspecies love at first sight.
I believe in soul connection for sure. And so I will say yes.
Okay, great. It's in your chart. Uranian style. Is there anything anyone needs to do to prepare to come to the workshop? Should they print out a particular chart, or should they just come and be open to receive?
I think that's the most important thing, because a lot of what I'm going to share, may sound at first like, another guy coming up with his far-fetched theories. So to me, it's not far-fetched. It's something that has been tested, and it really gives life to the 12th house. So my suggestion is to definitely come open-minded, but then don't take my word for it. Test it yourself. See if it applies in your chart, in your lives, and take it from there. I think we do need to learn more about the 12th house, because it is severely misunderstood in astrology. I think that astrologers are getting lost in that house.
I think it's so great in terms of your chart that you are focusing on the 12th house. And I have two more kind of 12th house questions I'll ask you very quickly. I read somewhere that you said you've never seen a ghost, but you had a fight with one. Is this a story?
I mean, that's the story. I was sleeping in the house I was a guest in the house of a woman who was doing a lot of psychic work, and a lot of it was very unprotected.
Yeah.
Um, and so in the middle of the night, around the, not middle, but around 4 in the morning, I started to feel this presence. And, how can you describe a presence? You can't. But when you're in it, you suddenly know that there's something there. And I was semi asleep, which is very weird. You may think, well, did you dream it or was it a reality? And then this thing started to literally push my head on the pillow. I was leaning on my side. It pushed my head on the pillow and I couldn't move.
Wow.
And I was basically pinned down on my bed violently. And then it started drilling into my ear like a vortex of wind and energy. And it was terrible. And, in these moments, it's almost like, you don't think rationally, the adrenaline is pumping. And I had no fear for some reason and
No, you had
commanded.
no fear. Yeah.
No, even though I was, in this surreal position. Um, but then I commanded this thing to get out and leave me. And it did. And I had an ear infection for the following days. So I guess that was kind of the proof that I didn't dream it.
Oh, wow. Well, I hope to never be a guest in that household. I'm not sure I would handle it as gracefully.
Yeah.
I'll just leave you with a final question. Um, to what extent do the charts and stories of other people fascinate you? How much of an emphasis, if any, does on storytelling or meta narrative framing, or as Jacqueline at ISAR used to say, reframing, um, play a part in your chart work?
I remember Jacqueline.
I
She
forget her
wrote
last name.
uh, Jane's.
Thank you. Yes.
She wrote a chapter about in one of the Opa books about reframing. So I'm definitely fascinated. I love my work. I love working with people. So I don't think you can be a good astrologer if you're not interested in people and helping them. I mean, hearing personal stories and it's a very intimate space and it's a sacred space. And if you don't enjoy it, I can imagine that it would be really a burden. So I do think that part of what drives me is not only the need and the fascination with bringing astrology so that it can help people the way it helped me, because that was my experience. Astrology was, kept me sane. But it's also a study into human experience. When you go through the stories and you hear what people go through, or superficial or meaningful, it adds puzzle to the mysteries of life. So to me, it's an ongoing exploration of why are we here and what is this all about? And every client adds to that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to cut myself off because that will just lead to another question. I will see you at the workshop, and I am going to stop the recording. Is there anything you'd like to add before we say goodbye?
Happy eclipse, everyone.
Yes, huh?
And I hope to see you on November 19th. Live or recording, right? They can get a recording.
That's right. Okay, now let's see if I can actually even stop the recording. But don't go away, Maurice.